This unit is on HohokamPottery and looking at how pottery can be used to date sites and archaeological materials, and also how it can be used to reconstruct patterns of production and exchange. But first, be sure that you read the article, Ceramic Markers of Ancient Irrigation Communities, by David Abbott, that is in the Readings module. The Hohokam culture is well known for its decorated red-on-buff pottery. In fact, when archaeologists were first defining the nature and extent of this prehistoric culture, they first called it the red-on-buff culture to distinguish it from the better-known Puebloan cultures of the northern Southwest that manufactured black-on-white pottery. Hohokam decorated pottery is very important for dating sites. Remember back to the Time and Space unit at the beginning of the semester, where we discussed how archaeologists look at changes in artifact form or style in order to define different types that share characteristics of form and style, and how these different types can be put in chronological sequence from earliest to latest, and these different types can be used to identify the time periods when different archaeological sites were occupied. For example, on the left-hand side of the slide is a whole vessel and broken sherds, pieces of a whole vessel, of Helibute red-on-buff, a decorated type that is characteristic of the colonial period between AD 750 and 950. This type is characterized by repeated small elements covering the design field. You can see in the vessel repeated sort of S-shaped figures, and on some of the sherds repeated images of birds, quail, lizards, snakes that cover the design field. In contrast, the later Sacaton red-on-buff type, characteristic of the sedentary period, has interlocking decorative elements that appear to look like textile designs. Rather than small repeated elements, there are these interlocking geometric designs. And when we find a site that has Helibute red-on-buff, we know that that site dates to the colonial period, between AD 750 and 950. And when we find a site that has Sacaton red-on-buff, we know that it dates to the sedentary period, between AD 950 and 1150. However, decorated pottery generally makes up a very small percentage of any collection of pottery from an archaeological site. In general, red-on-buff decorated pottery only accounts for some 3 to 5% of all the pottery found at a typical Hohokam site. The remaining 95 to 97% of the pottery are plain wares, pots that were not decorated with painted designs. They are not as sexy and interesting, perhaps, as the decorated pots, but they still contain a lot of information. The article by Abbott describes research that he and other colleagues worked on to identify where plainware pottery was produced, and then also to reconstruct its patterns of exchange. When you make a pot from clay, it is not made from pure clay. Clay is a plastic material. It shrinks as it loses water. Think of a mud puddle, and as the mud puddle dries out, the mud in the bottom starts to shrink and crack as it loses water. And when you fire a pot, you have made a pot from clay, and you place it in a fire to turn the clay into a form of synthetic stone, you are driving all the water out. You do not want it to shrink too much because it would break during firing. So potters add aplastic materials to the clay in order to reduce the amount of shrinkage and prevent cracking during firing. These aplastic materials are called temper. Temper is usually sand, crushed rock, sometimes even crushed up pot sherds. When people manufacture pots, they don't transport bulky materials like temper very far. They generally use locally available materials. So the tempers found within pots indicate the location where they were made. The Phoenix Basin is unique in that the mountains that surround the basin have different geologic histories, different rocks composed of different minerals. So as those rocks have broken down and eroded, creating the sands on the soils below them, these different sands have different mineral characteristics. So David Abbott and his colleagues mapped these surfaces, these petrofacies, these rock surfaces, to identify where there were similar distributions of sands containing the same minerals, as well as different distributions of sand containing different minerals. This map is from the article by David Abbott and shows sand petrofacies of the Phoenix Basin. Petro, rock, facies, surfaces. So this looks at where there are sands that share the same mineral characteristics versus sands that have different mineral characteristics. The Phoenix Basin is interesting because the mountains that surround it all have different geologic histories with different rocks composed of different minerals. And so as the rocks break down and erode to create these soils that surround these mountains, these soils and the sands within them have different mineral characteristics. When people manufacture pots, they don't make them just out of clay. Clay is an aplastic material. It shrinks as it loses water, which is bad when you're making a pot, because if you fire the pot to drive all the water out and harden the clay into a rock-like substance, it will shrink, and if it shrinks too much, it will crack. Think of a mud puddle, and as the mud puddle dries out, losing water, the mud surface begins to crack. When people were making pots, they would add an aplastic material to the clay to prevent shrinkage with water loss. This is called temper, as it tempers the clay and prevents it from shrinking and cracking during firing. Usually, as a tempering material, people added sand or crushed rock, or sometimes even crushed up pot sherds. When people made pots, they didn't transport these bulky materials very far, using those that were locally available. So the sands that are found within a pot reflect the geologic origins of where that pot was made. And differences in the sands in the Phoenix Basin allow us to identify where different pots were being made. Abbott and his colleagues first examined thin sections of sherds under microscopes. They take a sherd and using a rock saw cut a paper-thin piece that is mounted on a microscope slide and then viewed using cross-polarized light, which interacts with different minerals in different ways, allowing the different minerals that are present to be identified. While these images look very similar to us, those who are untrained in mineral identification, those who are skilled and experienced at mineral identification note the differences and can differentiate between phyllite, schist, and granite, each of which has a different geologic source. This allows the location where the temper was obtained from, and the pots were thus made to be identified. These patterns of sands within pots allowed Abbott and colleagues to identify not just where pots were being made, but where they were being traded to. They also looked at the vessel forms, the size and shapes of the different pots, ones that could be used in many cases for different purposes, and found that there was a very sophisticated system of specialized production and exchange of pottery during the pre-classic period. The next series of slides show where different pots were made and how they were distributed within the Salt Gila Basin. The village of Las Colinas, which is where Interstates 10 and 17 come together in West Phoenix, seems to have specialized in the production of certain types of vessel forms: small jars for serving food, small jars for cooking and storing, and other jars known as seed jars, that on the left-hand side, globular jars with small openings in the top, ones that could be sealed with a broken disc in order to close all your seeds inside and protect them from bugs and rodents. These were all being made at the village of Las Colinas and traded to other villages along Canal System 2, north of the Salt River, and to villages along the Scottsdale Canal System, also north of the Salt River. These differences in sands has allowed Abbott and his colleagues to identify not just where pots were being made, but also where they were being traded to. They also looked at different vessel forms, the different sizes and shapes of pots, some of which were used for different purposes, and they have been able to reconstruct a very sophisticated system of specialized production and exchange that existed during the pre-classic period. The village of Las Colinas, which is near where Interstates 10 and 17 come together, potters in this community produced small bowls for serving foods, small jars for cooking and storage, and what are also called seed jars. On the left-hand side, the globular jar with a small opening on top that could be sealed with a sherd and clay in order to protect seeds from rodents and bugs. These vessels were made at Las Colinas and traded all along Canal System 2 and also to villages in the Scottsdale Canal System. A similar suite of vessel forms were manufactured at villages to the south along the Gila River near Gila Butte, where distinctive mica is incorporated into the sand. These pots were produced down along the Gila River and traded to Canal System 1, the Lehigh System, and the Scottsdale Canal System. Potters in villages at the eastern and western ends of South Mountain specialized in the production of large ollas that would be used for storing water or food. Those that were produced at the east end of the South Mountains were distributed along Canal System 1 and into the Lehigh and Scottsdale Canal System, with some going into Canal System 2. Those pots produced at the western end of South Mountains were distributed all along Canal System 2 on the other side of the Salt River. All of the red on buff pottery was being produced down near Snaketown along the Gila River. Not only is there distinctive tempering with mica from Gila Butte, but they also used a distinctive clay that is only found along the Gila River. This clay fires out a lighter color, allowing the red decorations to stand out more prominently on the background painted surface. Produced along the Gila River, these painted vessels were distributed throughout all the different canal systems in the Phoenix Basin. So in order to have a complete suite of all the vessel forms that you would need for all of your household activities, of cooking food, of serving food, of storing food and other materials, you would have to obtain these from different producers living in different communities. This integrated different communities economically across the wider region. This exchange was probably not just for pots, but pots provide us some of the best evidence. The exchange is probably of other products that were produced in these different communities. In different communities, probably also produced complementary products in order to encourage exchange between them. This Gila Butte red on buff vessel shows a repeated design element of a trader bearing a burden basket and going perhaps from village to village, bringing their wares with them. As mentioned in the architecture unit, the ball courts likely served as a nexus for commercial activity. Ball courts provided a set time and place where large crowds from different communities would gather for ritual activities, also providing an opportunity for producers to market their goods to this large gathering of consumers. This artist's reconstruction of a ball game at the Snaketown site shows traders gathered in the plaza plying their wares to the assembled crowds. The specialized production that was just described existed during the pre-classic period when ball courts were in use. As the ball courts fell out of use after AD 1085, this specialized system of production and exchange transformed, and rather than producers exchanging with other producers living in different canal systems, during the classic period, pottery production and exchange becomes much more restricted. All the pottery consumed on one canal system was produced on that canal system, and there was very little exchange between canal systems. So the different communities came to be less integrated economically and perhaps less integrated politically as well. In addition to changes in the production and exchange of plainware pottery, during the classic period, a new decorated style is introduced. Polychrome styles, ones that have more than two colors combined together. In this case, Salado polychromes have black and white designs painted on a red surface. These decorative designs are very similar to decorative designs found on pots produced in the northern part of the state. These polychrome pots from northern Arizona show the similarities with the Salado polychromes found in the Hohokam area. And the introduction of these polychromes in the Hohokam area is one line of evidence that has been used to support these Puebloan polychromes from northern Arizona show similarities to the Salado polychromes found during the classic period in the Hohokam region. These are a line of evidence used to support the movement of immigrants from northern Arizona into the Hohokam region during the classic period. This migration is also supported by O'odham myths, which describe the movement of Puebloan people into the region.